There are silences in history that are louder than the clash of swords, and there are refusals that echo with more power than the greatest acts of creation. Before we step into the dusty roads of Perea to witness the moment the carpenter stood his ground against the Tetrarch, may the Almighty God protect and bless those who subscribe and like this content for our efforts. It might seem simple to you, but it brings us great joy. Also, please mention in the comments which part of the world you are watching from, what emotion this story gave you, and do you believe? It will make us happy to reply to your comments. Now, let us return to the Jordan Valley, where the air was thick with heat and the rumor of a new king was terrifying the old one. The year was roughly 32 or 33 of the Common Era, though for the people living under the shadow of the Herodian dynasty, time was measured not in years but in burdens. The location was Perea, the region, beyond the Jordan, a strip of land that belonged to the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas. This was not the same Herod who had slaughtered the innocents of Bethlehem decades prior. That was his father, Herod the Great, a man whose brutality was matched only by his architectural genius. No, this was Antipas, the son who had inherited a fraction of the kingdom and none of the greatness. He was a man who lived in a palace built on the bones of prophets, a man who wore purple robes to hide a trembling heart. He ruled Galilee and Perea by the grace of Rome, a puppet king whose strings were pulled by the emperor Tiberius, yet within his own small domain, he wielded the power of life and death with capricious cruelty. It was here, in this volatile territory, that Jesus of Nazareth had been ministering for weeks, slowly making his way toward Jerusalem. The atmosphere in Jesus's camp was one of heightened anxiety. The disciples, men of simple backgrounds, fishermen, tax collectors, zealots, were acutely aware of whose ground they were treading upon. They knew the stories of Perea. They knew that just a few miles away stood the dark fortress of Machaerus, the very place where the dungeons were still stained with the blood of John the Baptist. The memory of John was a fresh wound in the psyche of the nation. The wild prophet who had eaten locusts and honey, who had roared like a lion against the sins of the king, had been silenced not by a trial, but by the whim of a dancing girl and the pride of a drunkard. Antipas had beheaded him. Now, every time the wind blew through the reeds of the Jordan, it seemed to whisper John's name. And into this vacuum, into this land haunted by a martyred prophet, walked Jesus, doing miracles that made John's work look like a mere prologue. Herod Antipas sat in his winter palace, a structure of black basalt and imported marble that looked out over the shimmering, dead waters of the Salt Sea. He was a man consumed by a specific type of rot, the rot of a guilty conscience combined with paranoid superstition. He swirled the wine in his goblet, staring at the red liquid until it began to look too much like blood. His servants moved silently around him, afraid to break his concentration. Reports had been flooding in from the villages of Galilee and the towns of Perea. They spoke of a man who healed lepers with a touch, who opened the eyes of the blind, who commanded demons to flee, and who spoke with an authority that made the scribes look like stuttering children. Herod had heard these stories, and they terrified him. He did not see a Messiah, he saw a ghost. "It is John," Herod would whisper to his courtiers in the dead of night. "It is John, whom I beheaded. He has been raised from the dead." That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him. The terror of the Tetrarch was not rational, it was spiritual. He had killed the voice of God, and now the voice had returned, louder and more powerful. Herod wanted to see Jesus, but not for salvation. He wanted to see him to confirm his fears, to see if the head was reattached to the body, or perhaps to see a magic trick that would distract him from the gnawing emptiness of his soul. But coupled with this curiosity was a lethal intent. A king who kills one prophet finds it much easier to kill the second. The presence of Jesus in Perea was a destabilizing force. Crowds were gathering by the thousands. They were trampling crops, leaving their jobs, and whispering the dangerous word, Messiah. In the eyes of a Roman puppet ruler, Messiah did not mean savior, it meant insurrection. It meant Roman legions marching in to restore order. It meant Herod losing his throne. Therefore, Jesus had to go. Down in the valley, far from the marble floors of the palace, Jesus sat on a large stone beneath the shade of a terebinth tree. The dust of the road was on his feet. He looked nothing like a king, yet the air around him hummed with an energy that felt like the moment before a lightning strike. He was teaching the people about the narrow door, about the difficulty of entering the kingdom of God. Strive to enter through the narrow door, he told them, his eyes scanning the faces of the poor, the lame, and the desperate. For many, I tell you, will seek to enter and will not be able. His message was sobering. He was not promising them a political revolution against Herod or Rome. He was promising a revolution of the heart that would cost them everything. Peter stood near the edge of the crowd, his hand resting instinctively near the hidden knife in his belt. He did not trust Perea. He watched the horizon, scanning for the glint of Herodian armor. He knew that Antipas had spies everywhere, men who dressed like merchants or travelers but whose ears were tuned to the frequency of treason. Peter leaned over to John, speaking in a low voice. "We should move on," he muttered. "We are too close to Machaerus. If Herod took John, who was the greatest born of women, what will he do to the master?" John did not answer immediately. He was watching Jesus, captivated by the sorrow in his master's eyes. Jesus was not looking at the crowd, he was looking south, toward Jerusalem. He knew the timeline better than anyone. He knew that his hour had not yet come, but he also knew the wolves were circling. It was then that the disruption occurred. The crowd parted, rippling like water disturbed by a stone. A group of men walked through, their robes distinct, their fringes long, their phylacteries broad. Pharisees. Usually, when Pharisees appeared, it was to debate the law, to challenge Jesus on the Sabbath, or to trap him in his words. The disciples stiffened, ready for a theological argument. But these Pharisees did not come with scrolls or questions. They came with urgency. Their faces were grave, their pace quick. They were not the enemies from Jerusalem. They were the local leaders, perhaps men who actually respected Jesus, or perhaps men who simply wanted to avoid a bloodbath in their territory. They approached Jesus, ignoring the disciples who tried to block their path. Jesus stopped speaking and looked at them. He did not rise. He waited. One of the Pharisees, an older man with a gray beard and eyes that held genuine fear, spoke first. "Get away from here," the Pharisee urged, his voice low but carrying over the hush of the crowd. "Leave this place and go. Herod wants to kill you." The statement hung in the hot air like a suspended blade. The crowd gasped. The name of Herod was enough to freeze the blood of a common peasant. If Herod wanted you dead, you were usually dead by morning. The warning was clear. You are in his jurisdiction. You are in the kill zone. Run. Run back to Galilee, or run to the Decapolis, but get out of Perea. The disciples looked at Jesus, expecting him to stand up, gather his cloak, and signal the retreat. It was the logical thing to do. Self-preservation was the first law of nature. Why stay where the tyrant's sword was already sharpened? Why provoke a man who beheaded prophets for sport? The Pharisees stood there, waiting for his compliance. They felt they were doing him a favor. They were saving his life. In their minds, a living rabbi was better than a dead martyr. They expected fear. They expected panic. They expected Jesus to act like a man who wanted to survive, but Jesus did not move. He did not look at his disciples to check the escape route. He did not look at the Pharisees with gratitude for their intelligence report. Instead, a change came over his face. It was not anger, exactly, it was a supreme, sovereign contempt mixed with a steely resolve. He looked toward the direction of the palace, though it was miles away, as if he could see through the hills and walls directly into the eyes of the Tetrarch. "Go," Jesus said, his voice calm but vibrating with iron. "Go and tell that fox." The word shocked everyone. *Alapex, fox. In the culture of the time, calling a man a fox was not a compliment to his cleverness. It was an insult. It meant he was a scavenger, a minor predator, a creature of cunning but no real majesty. The lion was the symbol of royalty. The fox was the symbol of a destructive nuisance. A fox was a hole digger, a creature that struck in the dark and ran away. By calling Herod a fox, Jesus was stripping him of his royal dignity. He was saying, this man who calls himself a king, who sits on a throne and commands armies, is nothing but a scavenger in God's eyes. He is crafty, yes. He is dangerous to the chickens, yes. But he is no lion. Jesus continued, his message to the Pharisees transforming into a manifesto of his mission. "Go and tell that fox, behold, I cast out demons and perform cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I finish my course." The disciples stood stunned. Jesus was sending a direct challenge back to the ruler of the land. He was setting his own schedule. Herod had said, "Die or leave." Jesus replied, "I have work to do, and I will do it on my timeline, not yours." The phrases, "today," tomorrow, and the third day were not just literal days, they were a Hebrew idiom for a set, divinely appointed period of time. Jesus was declaring his sovereignty. He was saying that no earthly king, no paranoid tyrant, could shorten his ministry by even 1 hour. His schedule was set by the Father, not by the Tetrarch. I cast out demons and perform cures. This was the work of the kingdom. This was the work that Herod feared. By emphasizing this, Jesus was highlighting the contrast between the two kingdoms. Herod's kingdom was built on fear, death, and self-preservation. Jesus's kingdom was built on liberation, healing, and self-sacrifice. The fox destroys, the shepherd heals, but Jesus was not finished. He looked at the Pharisees, whose faces were now pale with the realization that they would have to carry this insulting message back to a volatile king. Jesus stood up then, the dust falling from his robes. He looked south again, and the sorrow returned to his eyes, deeper than before. Nevertheless, Jesus said, his voice dropping to a register of tragic inevitability, I must go on my way today and tomorrow and the day following, for it cannot be that a prophet should perish away from Jerusalem. The silence that followed this statement was profound. Jesus had just signed his own death warrant, but he had changed the venue. He was telling Herod, you cannot kill me, fox, because you are too small. My death is too great for Perea. My death belongs to the city of the great king. My death belongs to Jerusalem. It was a stinging critique of the religious capital. Jerusalem, the city of the temple, the city of God, had become the graveyard of God's messengers. Jesus was acknowledging that he was walking into a trap, but it was not Herod's trap. It was a destiny woven into the history of his people. The Pharisees slowly backed away, realizing that their warning had failed. They had tried to scare a man who feared nothing but God. They scuttled off like beetles, disappearing into the crowd to bring the news to the palace, news that would surely make Herod's paranoia explode into fury. The sun began to set over the Jordan Valley, casting long, purple shadows across the dry earth. The disciples began to set up the camp for the night, their movements mechanical, their minds racing. Judas Iscariot sat by the fire, counting the coins in the common purse, his eyes darting back and forth. He had heard the defiance in Jesus's voice. He realized that this was not going to end in a peaceful coronation. Jesus was antagonizing the powers that be. First the scribes, now Herod. Who was next? Rome? Judas felt the cold knot of disillusionment tightening in his stomach. He wanted a king who would crush the fox, not one who would walk willingly into the fox's trap in Jerusalem. As the stars came out, hanging low and bright over the desert, Jesus withdrew a stone's throw from the group. He knelt to pray. The interaction with Herod's messengers had triggered a lament in his soul. It wasn't fear of Herod, it was grief for Israel. "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem," he whispered to the night wind, "the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing." The metaphor was striking. He had called Herod a fox, a predator. Now he compared himself to a hen, a mother bird. In the face of a fox, a hen has no claws, no fangs. Her only defense for her chicks is to spread her wings and offer her own body as a shield. If the fox attacks, the hen dies first. Jesus was choosing the way of the hen over the way of the fox. He would not fight Herod with swords. He would absorb the violence of the world into his own body to save his children. The next morning, the camp was broken down. The march continued. They moved south, each step taking them closer to the border of Judea, closer to the final confrontation. The news of Jesus' defiance spread like wildfire through the countryside. He called the king a fox. The villagers whispered, "He is not afraid." This boldness attracted even more followers, but it also stripped away the casual observers. It was becoming clear that following this rabbi was a dangerous proposition. Days turned into weeks as they journeyed. The landscape changed from the fertile banks of the Jordan to the arid, rocky ascent toward Jericho. Throughout the journey, the shadow of Herod remained. Herod did not pursue them. Perhaps the message had done its work. Perhaps the insult had stunned him into passivity. Or perhaps he simply knew that if Jesus was heading to Jerusalem, he would eventually fall into the hands of Pilate and the Sanhedrin, saving Herod the trouble. But the fox kept watching. Finally, the day came when the pilgrims arrived at the gates of Jerusalem for the Passover. The city was heaving with humanity. Roman soldiers stood on the walls, their pilums gleaming, watching for any sign of trouble. The air smelled of roasting lamb and unwashed bodies. Jesus entered the city, not on a warhorse, but on a donkey, fulfilling the prophecy, weeping over the city that did not know the time of its visitation. The events of that week, the cleansing of the temple, the debates in the porticos, the Last Supper in the upper room, moved with the velocity of a landslide. And through it all, unknown to many, Herod Antipas was also in the city. He had come up from Tiberias for the festival, ostensibly to show respect for the Jewish customs, but really to maintain appearances and curry favor with the Jewish subjects. He was staying at the old Hasmonean Palace, a luxurious residence not far from the Temple Mount. On the night of the betrayal, while Jesus wrestled in Gethsemane and the disciples slept, Herod lay awake in his palace, drinking wine and listening to the sounds of the city. He did not know that the man he feared, the John come back to life, was being arrested just a mile away. He did not know that the Sanhedrin was convening an illegal night trial. He did not know that the fox and the hen were about to meet face to face. The arrest happened in the darkness. Torches, clubs, a kiss of betrayal. Jesus was dragged to the house of Annas, then to Caiaphas. He was beaten, mocked, and tried. As the morning sun broke over the Mount of Olives, turning the white stone of the temple to gold, Jesus was bound and led to the praetorium, to stand before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. Pilate was a man who despised the Jews and hated their religious squabbles. He saw Jesus as a nuisance, a harmless fanatic who had upset the priests. He tried to find a way to release him. He questioned Jesus, asking, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world." Pilate went out to the mob and declared, "I find no guilt in him." But the mob, incited by the chief priests, screamed, "He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee even to this place." The word, Galilee, caught Pilate's ear. It was a lifeline. "Is this man a Galilean?" he asked. When he learned that Jesus belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, Pilate saw a brilliant political maneuver. He could pass this problem off to Herod. It would flatter Herod, acknowledging his authority, and it would rid Pilate of a difficult decision. "Take him to Herod," Pilate ordered. And so, Jesus was bound again. Surrounded by Roman guards and a jeering mob, he was marched through the narrow, winding streets of Jerusalem, from the Antonia fortress toward the Hasmonean palace. The disciples had fled. Peter was weeping in a courtyard. John was following at a distance. Jesus was alone in the center of the storm. He walked with his head high, though his face was bruised and swollen from the blows of the temple guards. He knew where he was going. He was going to meet the fox. The prophecy of Perea was about to be fulfilled. He had finished his work, today and tomorrow, and now he was in Jerusalem. Inside the palace, Herod Antipas was roused from his morning lethargy by a messenger. "Excellency," the servant gasped, "the governor Pilate sends his greetings. He has sent you a prisoner, a Galilean, Jesus of Nazareth." Herod's eyes widened. The cup fell from his hand, spilling wine onto the mosaic floor. Jesus, here, in his palace. The fear that had plagued him for months suddenly evaporated, replaced by a surge of adrenaline and childish excitement. The ghost was real. The magician was here. "Bring him in," Herod shouted, adjusting his robes, checking his reflection in a polished bronze mirror. "Bring him in at once." Herod quickly assembled his court. He wanted an audience. He wanted witnesses. This was going to be the entertainment of the century. He imagined what he would ask. He imagined the miracles he would demand. Perhaps he would ask Jesus to turn water into wine, right here in the court. Perhaps he would ask him to levitate. Perhaps he would ask him to predict the future. The doors of the great hall swung open. The Roman soldiers marched in, their hobnailed boots clattering on the stone. Between them walked Jesus. Herod leaned forward on his throne, his eyes hungry. He expected a giant. He expected a man with fire in his eyes, a man who radiated terrible power. What he saw was a man in torn peasant robes, covered in dust and dried blood, his hands tied with rough rope. Jesus looked ordinary. He looked tired. But as Jesus was brought to the foot of the throne, he lifted his eyes. For the first time, the fox looked into the eyes of the lamb. Herod felt a chill run down his spine, a sudden, inexplicable desire to look away. But he forced a smile. He was the king. This prisoner was his subject. "So," Herod said, his voice echoing in the hall. "You are Jesus. I have heard many things about you." He stood up and descended a few steps. "They say you raised Lazarus. They say you fed 5,000. They say you are John returned." Herod circled Jesus, inspecting him like a prize horse. "I have wanted to see you for a long time." Jesus said nothing. He stood perfectly still, his breathing steady. "Come now," Herod jostled, trying to break the tension. "Don't be shy. I am not Pilate. I am your king. I am Herod. Perform a sign for us. Show us your power. Heal one of my servants. Or better yet," Herod pointed to a large vase. "Shatter that vase without touching it. Go on. Do it, and I might let you go." The courtiers giggled nervously. The soldiers watched with bored indifference. Everyone waited. But there was silence. Herod's smile faltered. He didn't like being ignored. "Did you not hear me? I commanded you to perform a miracle." Silence. Herod's face reddened. He moved closer, invading Jesus's personal space. "Speak to me. I have the power to release you or to send you back to Pilate. Are you a god or a madman? Defend yourself." Jesus continued to stare straight ahead. It was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of judgment. In Perea, Jesus had sent a message. "Go tell that fox." Now, in the presence of the fox, Jesus had no words left. He would not perform for a murderer. He would not cast pearls before swine. He would not degrade the power of the Holy Spirit to amuse a bored tyrant. This silence was the ultimate miracle refusal. Jesus, who had compassion on the begging blind man, who stopped for the bleeding woman, who touched the leper, now refused to offer a single drop of grace to the man who sat on the throne of pride. It was a silence that screamed. It said, "You have had your prophets. You had John. You killed him. You have had Moses and the law. You ignored them. You have no ear for the truth, so you will hear nothing." Herod realized he was being humiliated. The prisoner was judging the judge. The fox was being dismissed by the hen. The excitement in Herod turned to a cold, vicious spite. If this man would not be a magician, he would be a clown. He is a mute. Herod laughed, turning to his court. "He has no power. He is a fool. Look at him. He thinks he is a king?" The courtiers took the cue. They began to laugh. "If he is a king," Herod sneered, "he should be dressed like one." Herod snapped his fingers. "Bring the robe." Soldiers ran to fetch an old, gorgeous robe, a bright, shining garment, likely white or purple, used for festivals. They brought it to Herod. With a cruel grin, Herod threw the robe over Jesus' shoulders. It hung loosely on him, covering the blood and the dirt. "Hail, King of the Jews." Herod mocked, bowing low. "Look at him, the king of silence." The hall erupted in laughter. They mocked him. They spat on the floor near his feet. They treated the creator of the universe like a court jester. And through it all, Jesus stood in the majesty of his silence. He bore the mockery as he would bear the cross, willingly, knowing that this was the cup the Father had given him. Herod had his fun. He had proven, at least to himself, that Jesus was nothing special. Just another delusion. He felt a strange sense of relief. The ghost of John was gone. This was just a man. A pathetic, silent man. "Take him back to Pilate," Herod waved his hand dismissively. "Tell the governor I find nothing worthy of death in him. He is just a madman. Pilate can deal with him." As the soldiers grabbed Jesus to drag him away, Herod climbed back onto his throne. He felt lighter. He felt that he and Pilate, who had been enemies over a dispute regarding Galileans, would now be friends. They shared a secret. They had both looked at the truth and decided it was nothing. Jesus was led out of the palace. He had refused the miracle. He had refused the defense. He had refused to satisfy the curiosity of the fox. He walked back toward Pilate, back toward the whip, back toward the hill of the skull. The fox had had his moment of entertainment, but the Lion of Judah was marching toward his victory, not a victory of magic tricks in a palace, but the victory of blood poured out for the sins of the world. As the heavy doors of the Hasmonean palace slammed shut behind him, the silence of Jesus lingered in the hall, haunting the air. A silence that Herod would remember for the rest of his life. A silence that would echo until the day he stood before the white throne of judgment, where the books would be opened, and the fox would finally have no place to hide. The return journey from the Hasmonean palace to the Praetorium was a grotesque parade that cut through the heart of Jerusalem like a jagged scar. Jesus walked in the center of a phalanx of Roman guards, but he was no longer just a prisoner, he was now a spectacle. The robe that Herod Antipas had thrown over his shoulders, a garment of shimmering white silk woven with threads of silver that caught the mid-morning sun, fluttered around him in the wind. It was a garment meant for a king on a day of jubilation, a festival robe that signaled victory and wealth, but on the battered body of the Nazarene, it was a screaming paradox. The blood from the earlier beatings had begun to seep through the fine fabric, staining the pristine white with dark, irregular blotches of crimson, turning the symbol of royalty into a map of suffering. The mob that followed, swelled now by the curious and the cruel, pointed and jeered, their laughter bouncing off the limestone walls of the narrow streets. They saw a clown king, a jester sent back by the Tetrarch, a man too pathetic even to be executed by a Jewish ruler. Pilate stood on the pavement of the Gabbatha, the stone pavement, watching the procession return. His face hardened into a mask of irritation. He had hoped, with the desperate optimism of a bureaucrat trying to avoid a riot, that Herod would solve this problem. He had hoped Herod would either release the man as a harmless lunatic or execute him for some violation of Galilean law. But as he saw the prisoner returning, draped in the mockery of Herod's court, Pilate knew that the ball was back in his court. The political maneuver had failed to remove the burden, though it had succeeded in an unexpected way. A messenger had arrived just minutes before the prisoner, bearing a seal from Antipas. The message was warm, conciliatory, thanking Pilate for the gesture of respect. The old enmity between the Roman governor and the Jewish tetrarch, born of border disputes and slaughtered Galileans, had evaporated in the heat of their mutual rejection of the truth. They had found common ground in their shared contempt for this silent prophet. They had become friends that day, united by the bond of those who wash their hands of innocent blood. When Jesus was brought once more before the judgment seat, the atmosphere had shifted. It was no longer a legal inquiry, it was a blood sport. The chief priests and the elders, emboldened by Herod's mockery, pressed their advantage. They saw Pilate's hesitation not as mercy, but as weakness. They circled the dais like wolves who sense that the shepherd is asleep. Pilate summoned them, his voice echoing across the courtyard. He tried to reason with madness. He pointed out that neither he nor Herod, a man who knew Jewish law far better than a Roman ever could, had found anything in this man deserving of death. He offered a compromise, the logic of a politician who thinks justice is a commodity to be bartered. He would punish the man, he said. He would scourge him, a brutal enough warning for any would-be Messiah, and then release him. But the crowd, incited by the whispers of the Sanhedrin, would have none of it. They had tasted the possibility of a crucifixion, and their appetite was voracious. It was the custom at the feast to release one prisoner, a gesture of imperial goodwill meant to keep the peace. Pilate played his final card. He brought out Barabbas. Barabbas was everything the authorities claimed Jesus was: a violent insurrectionist, a murderer, a man who had actually raised a sword against Rome. He was a true fox, a man of cunning violence and chaotic rebellion. Pilate set them side by side, the silent, broken healer in the mockery of a king's robe, and the wild-eyed rebel with blood on his hands. "Whom do you want me to release for you?" Pilate asked. "Barabbas, or Jesus who is called Christ?" The answer came as a roar that shook the pillars of the praetorium. Barabbas. Not this man, but Barabbas. It was the ultimate inversion of justice. The people, the very brood that the hen had wanted to gather under his wings, chose the fox. They chose the violent over the peaceful, the murderer over the life-giver. In rejecting Jesus, they were not just rejecting a teacher, they were rejecting the very nature of God in favor of the nature of the world. They preferred the sword of Barabbas to the silence of Jesus. Pilate, seeing that he was gaining nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, took water and washed his hands before the crowd. It was a theatrical gesture of abdication, a claim of innocence that history would never grant him. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he declared. "See to it yourselves." Then came the scourging. The soldiers stripped Jesus of Herod's shining robe, the silk peeling away from dried wounds, and tied him to the post. The Roman flagrum, a whip of leather thongs weighted with lead and bone, did its work. It was a systematic dismantling of a human body, a calculated application of trauma designed to bring a man to the very edge of death without crossing it. Jesus bore it in silence. He did not curse. He did not beg. He absorbed the violence of the empire into his flesh. When it was over, they did not return Herod's robe. Instead, they found a scarlet military cloak, threw it over his shredded back, and pressed a crown of woven thorns into his scalp. They put a reed in his right hand as a scepter. The mockery of Herod was replaced by the mockery of Rome. "Hail, King of the Jews," they shouted, striking him with the reed. The silence of Jesus in the face of this brutality was not passivity, it was a containment of power so vast that if he were to speak a single word of judgment, the earth itself might have split asunder. He held the universe together while his own body was being torn apart. The journey to Golgotha began. It was the final procession. Jesus, unable to carry the crossbeam due to the severity of the scourging, stumbled and fell. Simon of Cyrene, a passerby coming in from the country, was pressed into service. He was forced to carry the wood, unknowingly becoming the first to literally take up the cross and follow him. The road was lined with people. Not all were enemies. There were women there, daughters of Jerusalem, who beat their breasts and wailed for him. They remembered the healings. They remembered the loaves and the fish. They saw the injustice, and their hearts broke. Here, for the first time since his silence before Herod, Jesus spoke. He stopped, turning his face toward the weeping women. His face was a mask of blood and sweat, but his eyes were clear, filled with that same terrible prophetic sorrow he had shown in Perea. "Daughters of Jerusalem," he rasped, his voice weak but distinct, "do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do these things when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" It was the hen warning the chicks one last time. He was not thinking of his own pain. He was seeing the future fires of AD 70, the Roman legions encircling the city, the temple burning, the slaughter that would come upon the children of these very women. He was seeing the consequences of rejecting the Prince of Peace. If Rome treated the innocent Son of God this way, the green wood, how would they treat the guilty revolutionaries, the dry wood, when the rebellion finally came? Even on the way to his death, he was the prophet, speaking truth to a city that was blind to its own doom. They reached the place of the skull. It was a rocky outcropping outside the city walls, a place of death and refuse. They crucified him there. The nails were driven through the wrists and the feet, pinning him to the wood. They lifted him up, suspended between heaven and earth, rejected by both. It was the third hour of the day. Above his head, Pilate had ordered a sign to be fastened. It was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." The chief priests had argued against it, demanding it be changed to, he said, "I am King of the Jews." But Pilate, perhaps finding a petty revenge against the Sanhedrin or perhaps struck by a sudden, stubborn adherence to truth, refused. "What I have written I have written." The title that Herod had mocked with a robe was now proclaimed in the three languages of the world, an irrevocable decree. Back in the Hasmonean palace, the mood had shifted. The morning's entertainment was over. Herod Antipas sat at his midday meal, but his appetite had deserted him. The wine tasted sharp, acidic. The laughter of the court felt hollow. He tried to engage in conversation about the Galilean tax revenues, but his mind kept drifting back to the silent man. He had expected a magician, he had met a mystery. The silence of Jesus was like a splinter in his mind. It was small, but it festered. Why hadn't he spoken? Why hadn't he begged? Herod had held the man's life in his hands, yet he had felt curiously powerless. He looked at his hands now, the hands of a king, ringed with gold, and they looked weak. He remembered John the Baptist. John had shouted. John had pointed fingers. John had been fire and thunder. This Jesus had been water, deep, still, and impossible to grasp. Herod summoned a servant. "What is happening at Golgotha?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Has the madman been dispatched?" "He is on the cross, Excellency," the servant replied, bowing low. "But there are reports. Strange things." "What kind of things?" Herod snapped. "The people are agitated. The sky. Look at the sky, Excellency." Herod stood up and walked to the balcony. It was noon, the time when the sun should have been at its zenith, blazing down on the white stones of Jerusalem. But the light was failing. A strange, bruised darkness was creeping across the horizon, swallowing the sun. It wasn't a storm cloud, it was a cosmic dimming, as if the eye of God was closing. The air grew cold. The birds stopped singing. A heavy, suffocating silence descended over the city, mirroring the silence of the prisoner. Herod gripped the marble railing. The superstition that ruled his life flared up into panic. This was not natural. This was an omen. "It is John," he whispered again, the old fear returning with new teeth. "I have killed him twice, and now the sun refuses to shine." At Golgotha, the darkness lasted for 3 hours. In that obsidian gloom, the spiritual battle that had begun in the wilderness reached its climax. The fox had bruised the heel of the seed of the woman, but the seed was crushing the serpent's head. Jesus hung in the void, bearing the weight of every sin, every act of violence, every silence of cowardice, every mockery of pride. He was drinking the cup of wrath that the Father had prepared, the cup that he had prayed to avoid in Gethsemane but had accepted for the sake of the joy set before him. The mockery continued even in the dark. The passers-by wagged their heads. "You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." It was the same temptation Herod had offered. Perform a miracle. Prove yourself. Save yourself. It was the logic of the fox. Self-preservation is the highest good. But Jesus held to the logic of the hen. Self-sacrifice is the highest love. He refused the miracle of coming down so that he could perform the miracle of rising up. He stayed on the cross. He stayed until the debt was paid. At the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani?" My God, why have you forsaken me?" It was not a cry of despair, but a quotation of Psalm chapter 22, a psalm that begins in agony but ends in the victory of the kingdom proclaimed to all nations. He was praying the scriptures even as he died. Then, knowing that all was now finished, he said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." He breathed his last. At that exact moment, the heavy veil of the temple, the massive curtain that separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the world, tore in two from top to bottom. It was a violent, divine rending. The barrier was gone. The silence of God was over. The way to the Father was open. The earth shook. Rocks split. The centurion who stood facing him, a veteran of Roman wars who had seen hundreds of men die, saw how he breathed his last and said, "Truly this man was the Son of God." The pagan soldier saw what the Jewish king and the Roman governor had missed. He saw the glory of God not in a robe or a crown, but in the death of the innocent. The Sabbath was approaching. The bodies could not remain on the cross. The soldiers came to break the legs of the victims to hasten death, so they could be taken down before sunset. They broke the legs of the 2 thieves who were crucified with him, men who had writhed and screamed in their agony. But when they came to Jesus, they saw that he was already dead. They did not break his legs, fulfilling the scripture that not a bone of him would be broken. The Paschal lamb must be whole. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear. Blood and water flowed out, the water of life and the blood of the covenant, pouring from the side of the second Adam just as Eve had been taken from the side of the first. Joseph of Arimathea, a rich man and a member of the council, a man who had not consented to their decision and action, went to Pilate. He asked for the body of Jesus. It was a bold move. To claim the body of a condemned traitor was to identify oneself with his cause. Joseph was done hiding. The death of Jesus had given him the courage that his life had not. Nicodemus, the one who had come to Jesus by night, also came, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds weight. These 2 secret disciples, men of the establishment who had watched the trial in silent horror, now stepped out of the shadows to perform the final act of love. They took the body down. They handled the shredded flesh with infinite tenderness, washing away the spit of the soldiers and the blood of the scourging. They wrapped him in a clean linen shroud. They laid him in Joseph's own new tomb, which he had hewn in the rock in a garden near the place of crucifixion. It was a rich man's grave for the one who had died a criminal's death, fulfilling the prophecy of Isaiah. They rolled a great stone to the entrance of the tomb and departed. The women, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, sat opposite the tomb, watching, marking the place. Then the sun set. The Sabbath began. A great silence fell over Jerusalem. In the palace, Herod Antipas finally slept, but his sleep was troubled by dreams of silence. In the praetorium, Pilate washed his hands again, but he could not feel clean. In the homes of the disciples, The doors were locked for fear of the Jews, and the air was thick with the suffocating grief of shattered hope. They did not understand. They had thought he was the Messiah, the one who would redeem Israel with power and might. They did not see how a dead man in a tomb could be the King of glory. They had forgotten the words about the third day. But the silence of the tomb was not an empty silence. It was a pregnant silence. It was the silence of a seed buried in the earth, dying so that it might bear much fruit. The fox had done his worst. The hen had laid down his life. The world thought the story was over. They thought the power of Rome and the cunning of Herod had won. They were wrong. The miracle Jesus had refused to perform for Herod, the cheap display of magic, was nothing compared to the miracle that was happening in the dark. He was not just waiting in the tomb, he was harrowing hell. He was breaking the bars of iron. He was setting the captives free. Saturday passed. The high Sabbath. The city prayed, oblivious that the Lord of the Sabbath lay cold in the rock. The priests celebrated the Passover, slaughtering lambs in the temple, unaware that the true lamb had already been slain. The irony was absolute. They performed the rituals of shadows while the substance lay buried within the city walls. Then came the first day of the week. The dawn was still gray, the light struggling against the night, when the earth shook again. An angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow, a true brightness that shamed Herod's mock robe. And for fear of him the guards trembled and became like dead men. The women arrived, bearing spices, expecting to anoint a corpse. They found an open door. They found an empty slab. They found a messenger who gave them the news that would change the molecular structure of the universe. Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he has risen, as he said. Come, see the place where he lay. He has risen. The fox had failed. The grave had failed. The silence was broken by the shout of life. Later that day, 2 disciples were walking to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking about all these things that had happened. They were sad, confused, defeated. A stranger drew near and walked with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What is this conversation that you are holding with each other as you walk?" They stopped, looking sad. One of them, named Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. They told him about Jesus of Nazareth, a prophet mighty in deed and word, and how the chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. "But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel," they said, the grief heavy in their voices. Then the stranger spoke. "O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. He walked them through the history of redemption. He surely spoke of the seed of the woman. He spoke of the blood of Abel. He spoke of the ram caught in the thicket. He spoke of the Passover lamb. He spoke of the suffering servant of Isaiah. He showed them that the cross was not a tragic accident, it was the divine plan. It was the only way to defeat the fox, the serpent, and death itself. When they drew near to the village, he acted as if he were going farther, but they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, for it is toward evening and the day is now far spent." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at table with them, he took the bread and blessed and broke it and gave it to them. And their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. And he vanished from their sight. It was him, the silent prisoner of Herod, the crucified victim of Pilate. He was alive, he was walking, he was eating bread. They rose that same hour and returned to Jerusalem. They found the 11 and those who were with them gathered together, saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and has appeared to Simon." The resurrection was the final word. It was the vindication of the silence. Jesus had not needed to defend himself before Herod because the Father was going to vindicate him before the whole world. He did not need a white robe from a petty king because he was clothed in the glory of the resurrection. He did not need to perform a magic trick to save his skin because he had the power to lay his life down and take it up again. Years later, the fate of the players in this drama would play out in grim irony. Pontius Pilate would be recalled to Rome in disgrace and, according to tradition, would end his own life in exile. Herod Antipas, the fox, would eventually lose his tetrarchy. His wife Herodias, whose ambition had driven him to kill John, would spur him to ask the Emperor Caligula for the title of king. Caligula, suspicious of his ambition, would instead banish him to Gaul. Herod would die in exile, stripped of his power, his wealth, and his title, a forgotten man in a foreign land. But the name of Jesus would grow. It would spread from Jerusalem to Judea, to Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. The kingdom he proclaimed, the kingdom of the narrow door, the kingdom of the seed dying in the earth, would outlast Rome. It would outlast the Herods. It would outlast every tyranny that tried to silence it. And the silence of Jesus before the fox remains a thunderous teaching for his followers. It teaches that truth does not need to argue with a lie to be true. It teaches that dignity does not come from the applause of power, but from the approval of God. It teaches that sometimes, the most powerful thing a believer can do in the face of a corrupt and mocking world is to stand still, to hold their peace, and to wait for the third day. For the third day always comes. The stone always rolls away, and the Lamb who was slain is now the Lion of the tribe of Judah, reigning forever and ever. The fox has his hole, but the Son of Man has the throne of the universe. The stone walls of the Hasmonean palace were thick enough to keep out the heat of the Judean sun, but they were proving woefully inadequate at keeping out the whispers. In the days following the Passover, a strange and suffocating atmosphere had settled over the residence of Herod Antipas. The Tetrarch had expected a return to normalcy after the chaotic events of the festival. He had expected the execution of the Nazarene to act as a cauterization, burning away the infection of religious fanaticism that had plagued his territories for months. He had expected silence, and indeed, the man Jesus had been silent before him, a silence that Herod had mocked and dismissed as the stupidity of a mute peasant. But now, that silence had escaped the confines of the throne room and was permeating the very air Herod breathed, growing heavier and more oppressive with each passing hour. It began with the rumors from the guards. Herod did not speak to common soldiers, of course, but his servants did, and servants are the true historians of any royal house. They brought him fragments of conversation overheard in the markets and at the city gates. They spoke of a tomb found open. They spoke of a stone, weighing more than 20 men could lift, rolled away as if it were a pebble flicked by a giant's thumb. They spoke of terror in the eyes of the Roman guards, men who were trained to hold the line against barbarian hordes but who now shook like leaves and spoke of blinding light and figures that were not men. Herod dismissed these tales as the hysteria of the ignorant, the natural byproduct of a tense week and too much wine. He laughed at them over his midday meal, tearing into the meat of a roasted quail with greasy fingers. The dead stay dead, he declared to his court, his voice booming a little too loudly. I beheaded John, and he stayed in his grave. Pilate crucified this Jesus, and he will stay in his. It is simple physics. It is the way of the world. But the laughter in the court was brittle. It did not reach the eyes of his guests. There was a tension in the room, a collective holding of breath. For even as Herod ate and drank and proclaimed the finality of death, there was a presence in the palace that contradicted him. It was not a ghost. Herod believed in ghosts, fearing them with the superstition of a guilty conscience, but this was something else. It was a change in the living. It was Joanna. Joanna was the wife of Chuza, Herod's own steward. She was a woman of high standing, woven into the fabric of the Herodian household, privy to its secrets and its rhythms. For years she had suffered from an infirmity, a weakness that the best physicians in Tiberias could not heal, until she had gone to the Nazarene and returned whole. Herod had tolerated her devotion to the wandering rabbi as a harmless eccentricity, the gratitude of a woman healed. But he had expected that devotion to shatter at the foot of the cross. He had expected Joanna to return from the Passover crushed, disillusioned, and weeping for a fallen idol. Instead, Joanna had returned with a fire in her eyes that terrified him. She moved through the corridors of the palace not with the heavy tread of a mourner, but with the light, purposeful step of a messenger bearing royal decrees. She did not weep. She did not wear sackcloth. When Herod looked at her, he did not see defeat. He saw a secret triumph that maddened him. She knew something. The whole household seemed to know something that the king did not. The very servants who poured his wine seemed to handle the cup with a new reverence, not for him, but for some invisible reality that superseded his authority. Herod sent for Chuza. The steward was a practical man, a man of ledgers and logistics, the kind of man who kept the machinery of the tetrarchy running while Herod played at being king. Chusa entered the private chambers, bowing low, his face a mask of professional neutrality. What is this rot I hear in the kitchens? Herod demanded, pacing the mosaic floor. Stories of angels? Stories of empty graves? Why do you not silence your wife, Chusa? She walks about this place as if she has seen a vision. Chusa hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. My wife went to the tomb early on the first day of the week, Excellency. With spices, to honor the dead, and, Herod pressed, stopping his pacing to stare at his steward. What did she find? Tell me she found a corpse. Tell me she found the rotting flesh of the fraud I sent back to Pilate. She found the tomb empty, my lord, Chusa said quietly. And she says she saw two men in clothes that gleamed like lightning. Herod snorted, a harsh, derisive sound. Lightning. The sun plays tricks on tear-filled eyes in the morning. And where is the body? Stolen, no doubt. The disciples took it, those fishermen and tax collectors. They want to keep the myth alive so they don't have to go back to mending nets. Perhaps, Chusa said, but the word lacked conviction. Not perhaps. Herod shouted, his face flushing purple. It is the only explanation. Do you think a man rises from the dead? Do you think the fox is so easily outwitted by a dead hen? I offered him a chance to show me a miracle. I commanded him, and he stood there like a stone. He had no power, Chusa. None. If he could not save himself from a whip, how can he conquer the grave? Chusa looked down at his hands. He called you a fox, my lord. It is true, but perhaps the miracle he refused to perform for your amusement, he performed for his own glory. Herod froze. The insubordination was subtle, but it was there. It was the infection spreading. Even Chusa, the man who counted his coins, was wavering. Get out, Herod whispered. Get out before I forget how much I need you. As Chusa left, Herod poured himself another goblet of wine, his hands trembling. He walked to the balcony that overlooked the city of Jerusalem. The Temple Mount dominated the view, the gold of the sanctuary reflecting the afternoon sun. Smoke rose from the altar of burnt offering, a steady column connecting earth to heaven. It all looked so permanent, so solid. The rituals, the stones, the power of Rome, the cunning of his own dynasty. It was a fortress of reality built against the chaos of the unknown. Why then did he feel like the ground beneath his feet was turning to water? He remembered the eyes of the prisoner. That was the splinter in his mind. When Jesus had looked at him, he hadn't looked at a king. He hadn't looked at a judge. He had looked at a tragedy. There was no fear in those eyes, only a terrible, crushing pity. It was the look a father gives a wayward son before the door is locked forever. Herod had tried to drown that memory in mockery, dressing the man in white, laughing with his soldiers. But the laughter had faded, and the memory remained. The silence of Jesus was not an empty void, it was a fullness that Herod could not comprehend. It was a judgment spoken without words. The days turned into weeks, and the infection did not recede. Instead, it exploded. The Feast of Weeks, Pentecost, arrived, and with it came a sound like a rushing mighty wind that swept through the city. Reports came to the palace of a disturbance near the temple. Thousands of people gathering. The fishermen, the ones Herod had dismissed as cowards, were standing in the public squares, shouting like prophets. They were speaking in tongues, languages they had never learned, proclaiming the mighty works of God. Herod summoned his spies. What are they saying? He demanded. Are they calling for a revolt? Are they sharpening swords? No, Excellency, the spy reported, looking baffled. They're talking about the man Jesus. They say God raised him from the dead. They say he is the Lord. They say that by killing him, we only fulfilled the plan of God. And the people? Herod asked, gripping the arms of his chair. Do they stone them? The people are pierced to the heart, the spy said. 3,000 were baptized in the mikvahs today alone. They are joining this way. Herod sank back into his chair. 3,000, an army raised not with gold or spears, but with a story of a dead man walking. It was impossible, it was madness, and yet, it was happening under the very nose of the Sanhedrin and the Roman garrison. Pilate was reportedly anxious, sending extra patrols into the streets, but he did not intervene. Perhaps Pilate, too, remembered the dream his wife had had. Perhaps Pilate, too, was washing his hands of a matter that would not wash off. The atmosphere in the palace grew toxic. Herodias, the woman whose ambition had been the architect of John the Baptist's death, watched her husband's unraveling with cold contempt. She saw his fear as weakness. To her, power was a simple equation. You kill your enemies, and if their ghosts haunt you, you kill their memory too. You are obsessed, she told him one evening as he stared into the fire. It is John all over again. You see prophets in every shadow. This Jesus is dead, Antipas. Let the peasants have their superstition. It will fade. They will get hungry, or bored, or the Romans will crucify a few more of them, and it will end. You did not see him, Herod murmured, not looking at her. You did not see him in this hall. I offered him his life, in a way. I gave him a stage. All he had to do was speak. Just one word, one trick, and he looked at me as if I were nothing. As if I were the ghost, and he was the reality. He was a fool, Herodias spat. No, Herod said, turning to look at her, his eyes hollow. A fool argues. A fool begs. A fool tries to bargain with a king. He did none of those things. He judged me, Herodias. He weighed me in the balance and found me wanting, and he didn't even have to open his mouth to do it. And now they say he is alive. If he is alive, Herodias said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, then kill him again. Arrest these followers. Make an example of them. Show them that the fox still has teeth. But Herod hesitated. He remembered the feeling of the crowd in Galilee. He remembered the way the people hung on the words of the Nazarene. And he remembered the strange, supernatural darkness that had fallen over the land when the man died. He was afraid. For the first time in his life, the cunning fox was afraid of a trap he could not see, a snare set not by men, but by God. Among the courtiers, there was a young man named Manaen. He had been brought up with Herod, a foster brother of sorts, sharing the same tutors, the same luxuries, the same privileged air of the palace. But Manaen had always been different. While Herod grew into the cunning of his father, Manaen retained a curiosity, a hunger for something that the decadent court could not satisfy. He had watched the trial of Jesus from the shadows of the pillars. He had seen the white robe. He had heard the mockery. And he had felt the sickness in his soul. Manaen began to slip away from the palace at night. He did not go to the taverns or the brothels. He went to Solomon's portico in the temple. He went to the houses in the lower city where the followers of the way gathered to break bread. He listened to Peter, the fisherman who had once fled in terror but now stood like a rock. He listened to the stories of the resurrection. And in those stories, Manaen found the key to the silence that haunted Herod. One night, Manaen returned to the palace late, his cloak smelling of the smoke of common oil lamps. He found Herod awake, pacing the terrace. "Where have you been, Manaen?" Herod asked, his voice suspicious. "Consorting with the rebels? Consorting with the truth, Antipas," Manaen replied softly. He used the familial name, a risk that only a foster brother could take. Herod stopped pacing. "Truth? What is truth?" Pilate asked him that, you know. He didn't answer him either. "He is the answer," Manaen said. "I have heard them, Antipas. The witnesses. They are not lying. Men do not die for a lie they invented. They saw him. He ate with them. He showed them his hands." "Stop it," Herod hissed. "I will not hear this madness in my own house." "It is not madness," Manaen pressed. "It is the kingdom of God. It is what John spoke of. It is what the prophets wrote of. The fox has his hole, Antipas, but you are hiding in a collapsing tunnel. There is light outside, if you would only walk out." Herod stared at Manaen, seeing the betrayal. "You too, my own brother? Has the sorcery taken you as well?" "It is not sorcery. It is life. He is the king, Antipas. The true king. Your throne is a shadow. His is eternal." Herod drew his dagger. It was a reflex, the instinct of the fox when cornered. He held the blade to Manaen's throat. "I could kill you. I could silence you right here." Manaen did not flinch. He looked at Herod with the same expression that Jesus had worn, not judgment, but pity. "You can kill me," Manaen whispered. "But you cannot kill the truth. You cannot kill the silence. It will scream in your ears until the day you die." Herod's hand trembled. He dropped the dagger. It clattered on the stone, the sound echoing loud in the night. "Go," he rasped. "Leave this palace. If I see you again, I will not hesitate. Go to your fishermen. Go to your ghost. But do not come back." Manaen left that night. He walked out of the palace of gold and marble and into the streets of Jerusalem, joining the community of the believers. He would become a teacher in the church at Antioch, a leader in the movement that would turn the world upside down. He left the fox to his hole and followed the lamb. Herod was left alone. The isolation was total now. His wife pushed him toward violence, his steward served a different master, his foster brother had defected, and the city below him was swelling with the praise of the man he had mocked. He felt the walls closing in. In an attempt to regain control, to assert his reality over the encroaching nightmare, Herod threw himself into the administration of his realm. He planned building projects. He organized feasts. He increased the taxes. He tried to be the Herod of old, the builder, the ruler, the fox who outsmarted the hounds. But everything tasted like ash. The wine was sour. The music was discordant. Every time he saw a white robe, he flinched. Every time a silence fell over the conversation at dinner, his heart hammered against his ribs. Then came the final blow to his composure. A report from Caesarea Maritima. Pilate had been recalled. The Roman governor, the man who had shared in the crime, was gone, summoned to Rome to answer for his mismanagement. Herod was now the last man standing of the trio that had condemned the Nazarene: Caiaphas, Pilate, and Herod. Caiaphas was losing his grip on the people. Pilate was in disgrace. And Herod? Herod felt the eyes of the unseen watcher upon him. He began to have dreams. In them, he was back in the hall. Jesus was there, wearing the white robe. But in the dream, Jesus was not silent. In the dream, Jesus opened his mouth, and from it came not words, but a roaring wind that stripped the gold from the walls, tore the purple from Herod's back, and blew the palace down stone by stone until Herod was standing naked in a desert, with nothing but the laughter of foxes surrounding him. He would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, calling for lights, calling for guards. Herodias, sensing her husband's weakness and fearing the loss of their status, devised a plan. It was the fatal error of their lives, born of hubris and desperation. "We must go to Rome," she declared one morning. "We must go to the emperor. You are a tetrarch, but you should be a king. If you have the title of king, the people will respect you. The superstition will fade in the face of true imperial power. Agrippa has been made a king. Why not you? You have served Rome longer. You have kept the peace." Herod resisted at first. He felt a lethargy, a spiritual heaviness that made the prospect of travel exhausted him. But the ambitious voice of the fox's mate was relentless. She goaded him, she shamed him, she promised him that a crown would banish the ghosts, so they prepared the ships. They packed the gold, the jewels, the bribes for the court of Caligula. They left the land of Israel, the land where the blood of prophets cried out from the ground. As the ship pulled away from the port of Joppa, Herod looked back at the hills of Judea. He felt a strange finality. He was leaving the land of the living. He was running from the silence, but he was carrying it with him in the hold of his soul. The journey to Rome was long and arduous. The sea was rough, as if the very waters were rejecting him. When they finally arrived in the capital of the world, they found a city that cared nothing for the petty rulers of the East. Caligula, the mad emperor, was unpredictable, cruel, and easily bored, a mirror image of Herod himself, but with the power to destroy worlds. Herod presented his case. He laid out his service, his loyalty, his wealth. He asked for the crown. But the fox had been outmaneuvered. Agrippa, Herod's nephew and rival, had sent letters ahead. He accused Herod of treason. He accused him of stockpiling weapons. He accused him of conspiring with the Parthians. Caligula looked at Herod with cold, dead eyes. "Is it true, Antipas?" the emperor asked, toying with a grape. "Do you have armor for 70,000 men stored in your armories?" Herod stammered. He tried to explain. It was for defense. It was for Rome. But the cunning that had served him so well in Galilee, the ability to dodge and weave, deserted him. In the face of the ultimate worldly power, the fox was cornered. "You are a conspirator," Caligula decided, with a wave of his hand. "You are stripped of your tetrarchy. Your wealth is confiscated. You are banished." "Banished?" Herod whispered. "To where, Caesar?" "To Gaul," Caligula said, laughing. "To Lugdunum, a cold, wet place for a fox. Go and dig your holes there." Herodias was given the chance to stay in Rome, to keep her freedom. But in a final, twisted act of loyalty, she chose to go with him. They were led out of the imperial palace, stripped of their purple, stripped of their dignity. The exile was a slow death. Lugdunum was a grim frontier town, far from the sun-drenched hills of Galilee, far from the marble palaces and the warm baths. The winters were long and gray. They lived in a small villa, watched by Roman guards, forgotten by the world. The gold was gone. The courtiers were gone. There was no one to mock. There was no one to impress. Herod Antipas spent his days sitting by a window, watching the rain fall on the dark forests of Gaul. He was an old man now, his face lined with bitterness and regret. The cunning fox had been caught in a trap of his own making. He had sought to save his life, and he had lost it, and in the silence of that exile, the memory of the Nazarene returned to him with unrelenting clarity. He played the scene over and over in his mind. The white robe, the jeering soldiers, the silence. He realized now what the silence meant. It hadn't been emptiness. It had been a refusal to engage with a lie. Jesus had refused to validate Herod's fake reality with a display of power. He had refused to cast his pearls before a man who loved the mud. Herod wondered, in the long, sleepless nights, what would have happened if he had listened. What if, instead of asking for a magic trick, he had asked for forgiveness? What if he had fallen off his throne and knelt in the dust beside the prisoner? What if he had said, "I am the one who is lost. I am the one who is bound." But the fox does not kneel. The fox runs. And now he had run to the end of the earth, only to find that he could not outrun himself. News from the east was rare, but travelers sometimes brought stories. They spoke of a new religion that was conquering the empire. They spoke of a kingdom that had no borders, a king who ruled from heaven. They spoke of Manaen, the teacher in Antioch. They spoke of Joanna, the witness of the resurrection. They spoke of a fire that could not be quenched. Herod listened to these stories with a mixture of horror and awe. The hen had won. The brood was gathered. The wings were spread over the nations, protecting the weak, the poor, the outcasts. And the fox was left outside, in the cold and the dark, shivering in the rain. One evening, as the sun set behind the Gallic mountains, painting the sky in colors that reminded him of the blood on the white robe, Herod Antipas closed his eyes. The silence of the room was heavy, but it was no longer the pregnant, holy silence of Jesus. It was the empty, hollow silence of a soul that has consumed itself. He had called the King of Kings a fox, but in the end, he was the one who had been hunted down by the hound of heaven, cornered by grace, and having refused it, was left with nothing but his own reflection in the glass of history. He died in obscurity, his name becoming a footnote in the story of the man he mocked. The cunning fox was buried in foreign soil, while the silent king reigned from the throne of the universe. The miracle he had demanded was never performed for him, but the miracle he had rejected, the miracle of the resurrection, had remade the world, leaving Herod Antipas as a tragic monument to the man who stared into the face of God and asked for a parlor trick. The silence was final now. The story was told. The third day had come and gone, and the eternal day had begun, a day in which there was no place for foxes, but only for children of the light. The winds of Gaul were merciless, tearing through the valleys of Lugdunum with a ferocity that seemed to mock the fragile legacy of the exiled king who lay buried beneath its soil. Herod Antipas, the tetrarch of Galilee, the builder of Tiberias, the son of the great Herod, was now nothing more than dust in a barbarian land. There was no monument to mark his resting place, no eternal flame to signify his royalty. The silence of the grave had finally claimed the man who had been terrified of silence. His name, once spoken with fear in the marketplaces of Jerusalem and the fishing villages of Capernaum, was now whispered only as a cautionary tale, a footnote in the sprawling, bloody history of the Roman Empire. The fox had found his hole, and the earth had closed over him, indifferent to his ambitions and his paranoia. But while the memory of the fox faded into the gray mists of the west, the name of the one he had mocked was rising like the sun in the east. The movement that Herod had hoped would die with the crucifixion had not only survived, it had metastasized. It had crossed borders, languages, and cultures. It had jumped from the Jewish cradle into the Gentile world, carried by men and women who possessed a courage that bewildered the authorities. The silence of Jesus before Herod had become the shouting of the church to the nations. The white robe of mockery had become the white robe of the martyrs, washed in the blood of the Lamb. In the bustling, cosmopolitan city of Antioch, far to the north of the tragedies of Jerusalem, The legacy of that encounter in the Hasmonean palace was finding a strange and beautiful resolution. Antioch was a city of lights, a jewel of the East, where Greek philosophy, Roman law, and Eastern mysticism collided in a chaotic symphony of life. It was here, in this melting pot, that the followers of the Way were first called Christians, little Christs. And among the leaders of this vibrant, exploding community was a man whose very existence was a testimony to the unpredictable grace of God. His name was Manaen. Manaen sat in the courtyard of a house church near the Orontes River. He was an older man now, his hair gray, his face lined with the maps of 1,000 journeys, but his eyes held a youthful, piercing clarity. Around him sat a group of new believers, Greeks, Syrians, Jews, slaves, and freedmen. They listened with rapt attention, for Manaen possessed a story that no other teacher in the church could tell. He was not a fisherman like Peter. He was not a Pharisee like Paul. He was a child of the palace. "Tell us again, Manaen," a young Greek man asked, leaning forward. "Tell us about the fox." Manaen smiled, a sad, knowing smile. He looked down at his hands, hands that had once held golden goblets in the court of Tiberius, hands that had touched the silk robes of royalty. "The fox," Manaen mused, his voice rough with memory. "Yes, I knew the fox. I nursed at the same breast as Herod Antipas. We played the same games in the courtyards of Jericho. We learned to read from the same scrolls. I knew his heart before it was hardened by power. I knew him when he was just a boy, afraid of his father's shadow, desperate for approval." The courtyard went silent. It was hard for these simple believers to reconcile their humble teacher with the monster who had beheaded the Baptist. "Antipas was not born a monster," Manaen continued. "He was made one, brick by brick, lie by lie. He learned early that in the world of the Herods, you are either the hammer or the nail. He chose to be the hammer. He learned that truth is dangerous, so he became a master of the half-truth. He learned that silence is a vacuum that must be filled with noise, with music, with building projects, with anything to drown out the voice of conscience. He became a fox because he was terrified of being a lamb." Manaen paused, looking up at the stars that hung over Antioch, the same stars that looked down on the ruins of Herod's life. "I was there," he whispered, "when the report came about Jesus. I saw the fear in Antipas's eyes. He thought it was John the Baptist risen from the dead. You see, guilt has a way of resurrecting the past. Antipas could wash the blood of John off his hands, but he could not wash it out of his mind. When Jesus appeared, doing miracles, speaking with authority, Antipas was paralyzed. He wanted to see him, yet he wanted to destroy him." "And the trial?" a woman asked softly. "Were you there?" "I was there," Manaen nodded. "I stood in the shadows of the hall of the Hasmoneans. I saw the Roman soldiers drag the master in. I don't know what I expected. Fire? Lightning? I expected a king who would look like the kings one grew up with, arrogant, loud, demanding. But then I saw him." Manaen closed his eyes, painting the scene on the canvas of his mind. He was bruised. He was dirty. He was tied with ropes. But he stood with a dignity that made the throne look like a child's chair. Antipas was frantic. He was dancing around him, asking for a sign, asking for a trick. "Entertain me," he said. "Prove yourself." It was the plea of a hollow man begging to be filled. But Jesus said nothing. "Why?" the young Greek asked. "Why didn't he speak?" "He spoke to Pilate. He spoke to the high priest. Because," Manaen said, his voice firm, "Herod had killed his conscience. He had beheaded the voice of repentance when he killed John. When you silence the prophet who calls you to turn, you eventually lose the ability to hear the word who calls you to live." Jesus refused to cast his pearls before swine. He refused to turn the power of the Holy Spirit into a courtroom drama for a bored tyrant. His silence was the loudest thing I have ever heard. It screamed judgment. It screamed that the time for talk was over. Manaen leaned forward, his eyes burning. "And that white robe, I saw them put it on him. It was a robe of festive joy, a robe of victory. They meant it as a joke. They meant to say, 'Look at this fool who thinks he is a king.' But as I watched him stand there, silent, mocked, covered in that shining garment, I realized the irony was on them. He was the king. He was the king who conquers not by shedding the blood of others, but by shedding his own. He was the king who wins not by shouting down his enemies, but by dying for them. Antipas thought he was the judge, but he was the prisoner. Jesus was the free man. And that is why you left? The woman asked. That is why I left, Manaen affirmed. I realized I could not serve two kings. I could not eat the bread of the fox and drink the cup of the lamb. I walked out of the palace, and I never went back. I lost my status. I lost my wealth. I lost my brother. But I found the kingdom that cannot be shaken. The lesson ended, but the impact lingered. In Antioch, the story of the fox and the lamb became a foundational teaching. It taught the early church that the powers of this world, the political maneuvering, the celebrity, the demand for signs and wonders, were nothing compared to the quiet, suffering faithfulness of the cross. It taught them that sometimes, God is silent not because he is absent, but because he is sovereign, and he does not need to explain himself to those who have no intention of obeying. Meanwhile, back in the land of Israel, the grim prophecies that Jesus had spoken on his way to the cross were grinding toward their fulfillment. The generation that had rejected the hen was now facing the wolves. The Roman Empire, once the guarantor of Herod's power, was becoming the instrument of God's judgment. The year was 66. The tension that had always simmered between the Jews and the Romans boiled over into open revolt. The Zealots, men who possessed the spirit of Barabbas, seized control of the temple. They stopped the daily sacrifices to the emperor. It was a declaration of war. The Roman legions, led by Vespasian and his son Titus, marched south. The foxes of Rome were coming to hunt. For 3.5 years, the war raged. Galilee, the land where Jesus had walked, where he had fed the 5,000 and calmed the storm, was turned into a scorched wasteland. The cities that had rejected him, Chorazin, Bethsaida, Capernaum, were devastated. The words of Jesus echoed with terrifying precision. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! Then, the legions reached Jerusalem. The siege began. It was a time of horror that eclipsed anything the city had ever known. Inside the walls, famine stalked the streets. The factions fought each other, burning the food stores, driven by a madness that seemed demonic. The women of Jerusalem, the daughters for whom Jesus had wept, found themselves in a nightmare where the living envied the dead. The cry of, "Blessed are the barren," became a literal reality as mothers watched their children starve. But amidst this apocalypse, there was a remnant that remembered. The Christians in Jerusalem, the community that remembered the words of the Master, did not stay to fight. They remembered the warning. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. While the zealots sharpened their swords and trusted in the walls of the temple, the followers of the way opened the gates of their hearts to the prophecy. They fled. They crossed the Jordan, moving into the region of Perea, the very land where Jesus had called Herod a fox, and found safety in the city of Pella. They were the chicks who listened to the hen's warning. They hid under the wing of his word and were saved from the fire. In the year 70, the end came. Titus breached the walls. The temple, the magnificent structure of gold and white stone, the pride of the nation, the place where Herod the Great had poured his genius, was set ablaze. The gold melted and ran down into the cracks of the stones. The Roman soldiers, in their greed to get the gold, pried the stones apart, literally leaving not one stone upon another. The silence of God in the Holy of Holies was broken by the screams of the dying and the roar of the flames. The Hasmonean palace, where Herod Antipas had sat on his throne and mocked Jesus, was gutted. The judgment hall where the white robe had been draped over the Savior was reduced to rubble. The physical structures of the powers that had condemned Jesus were erased from the earth. The fox's den was destroyed. The governor's seat was overturned. The high priest's house was burned. But in Pella and in Antioch and in Rome and in Alexandria, the body of Christ was alive. The temple of stone was gone, but the temple of living stones was growing. The sacrifice of bulls and goats had ceased, but the sacrifice of praise was rising from every corner of the empire. Years turned into centuries. The Roman Empire, which seemed as eternal as the stars, began to crumble. It rotted from within, consumed by its own corruption, its own violence, its own fox-like cunning that eventually devoured itself. The Caesars turned into dust. The legions marched into oblivion. Yet, the story of the confrontation in the palace remained. It was written down by Luke, the physician, who perhaps heard it from Manaen himself or from Joanna. It was preserved in the scroll of the Gospel, copied by monks in candlelit cells, preached from pulpits in wooden churches, whispered in secret gatherings in catacombs. The refusal of the miracle became a touchstone for the church in every age. When the martyrs stood before the lions in the Colosseum, they remembered the silence of Jesus. They did not rail against the emperors, they sang hymns. They did not perform magic tricks to save their skins. They offered their bodies as a living sacrifice. They knew that the Herods of the world could only kill the body, but they could not touch the soul. In the 20th century and the 21st, the dynamic remained the same. Tyrants rose and fell. Men of power, like Herod, demanded that the church perform for them, that it bless their wars, that it validate their greed, that it perform miracles of social utility to prove its worth. And time again, the true church had to learn the discipline of the silence of Jesus. It had to learn to say no to the court of the fox so that it could say yes to the will of the Father. The contrast between Herod and Jesus is the contrast between two ways of being human. Herod represents the path of the ego, self-preservation, noise, manipulation, the desperate need to be seen, the fear of silence, the belief that power is the ultimate reality. Jesus represents the path of the Spirit, self-emptying, truth, gentleness, the security of sonship, the embrace of silence, the knowledge that love is the ultimate power. The fox digs a hole to hide. The hen spreads her wings to die. The fox consumes. The hen provides. The fox leaves a legacy of fear. The hen leaves a legacy of life. Let us return, one last time, to the image of the throne room. It is the end of time. The books are opened. The great white throne is set. But the one sitting on it is not Herod, nor Pilate, nor Caesar. It is the Lamb who was slain. He is wearing a robe, not the mockery of Herod, but a robe dipped in blood, and on his thigh is written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Herod Antipas stands before him. The roles are finally and eternally reversed. The fox stands before the lion. There is no need for questions now. There is no demand for a sign. The sign is the scars on the hands of the judge. The silence that Herod hated is now the silence of his own lack of defense. What can the fox say to the one who offered him everything, and whom he treated as nothing? The silence of Jesus in the palace was a mercy, a final opportunity for Herod to look inward. But the silence of the judgment is a verdict. But look, there is a crowd around the throne. It is a multitude that no man can number. There is Peter, there is John, there is Mary Magdalene, and there, standing in the light of the Lamb, is Joanna. There is Manaen, there is the thief from the cross. There are the millions who chose the way of the hen, who found refuge under the wings of the Almighty. They are not silent, they are singing. Their voices are like the sound of many waters, drowning out the memory of every tyrant, every lie, every act of cunning that ever poisoned the earth. The story of the time Jesus refused to perform a miracle is not just a story about a bad king and a good prophet. It is a revelation of the nature of God. God is not a vending machine for our amusement. He is not a magician for our boredom. He is not a political mascot for our ambitions. He is the Holy One who demands the entirety of our hearts. He comes to us in weakness to disarm us. He comes to us in silence to listen to us. He comes to us in suffering to heal us. If we approach him as Herod did, demanding proof while holding onto our pride, we will find only silence. We will find a mirror that reflects our own emptiness. But if we approach him as the weeping women did, as the broken thief did, as the repentant Manaen did, if we approach him acknowledging that we are poor, blind, and naked, then the silence is broken. The king speaks, and the word he speaks is, "Come." The fox is gone. His palace is dust. His dynasty is a ruin. But the hen is still gathering her brood. The wings are still spread. The invitation still stands. The miracle that Herod missed is available to anyone who is willing to stop playing the game of the world and step into the reality of the kingdom. It is the miracle of the new birth, the miracle of the heart of stone turning into a heart of flesh, the miracle of the silence of death being swallowed up in the victory of life. The journey that began in Perea with a warning about a fox ends in the New Jerusalem with the worship of the Lamb. The road is long, and the narrow door is hard to find, but the one who walks it has gone before us. He has faced the fox and won. He has faced the grave and won. And now, he waits. Not in the silence of judgment, but in the quiet anticipation of love, waiting for the sons and daughters to come home, where the noise of the world will fade away, and the only sound will be the song of the redeemed. echoing forever in the halls of the father's house. The fox has no place there. Only the children, only the children,